Hey friends, welcome to This Cultural Moment. I'm John Mark Comer. I'm sitting here in Portland, Oregon, where I lead and pastor Bridgetown Church and teach the way of Jesus. I'm here with Mark Sayers, all the way from Melbourne, Australia, where he does the same. Mark is well known as a cultural commentator. So in this podcast, I essentially sit here and siphon out all that's in, well, not all, because there's too much to be measured, but a lot of what's in Mark's mind and imagination. We're wrapping up a series on what is post-Christian culture, talking in depth about our cultural moment. In this episode, we ask the question, is there something beyond post-Christian culture?
So it has freedom, but it has little meaning. With a little meaning in a secular society, you're not going to necessarily fall back into religion. You'll start to rediscover what Eric Vogelin called the political religions. That sense of utopianism, that sense of a political vision which has religious undertones, which asks for more.
Mark, we're wrapping up this conversation about post-Christian culture and pre-Christian, then to Christian or Christianized culture, post-Christian culture, all of its implications for church, the missional movement, what it got right, what it got wrong. And then our last episode, its implications for following Jesus and the need to return to the way of Jesus, to the practices or the spiritual disciplines, to community, not relevance, or at least not only that, but resilience. What's the next thing, or are we already to the next cultural moment? Is there something past post-Christian culture, or do we just sit in this kind of reactionary rebellion against all things Christ and Christianity indefinitely?
Yeah, and I think what's happened is part of the shock of the last few years, and by shock I talk about the economic crisis that happened in 2008, 2009, particularly probably felt more with the Brexit result in the UK than the election of Donald Trump, where all of a sudden politics seemed to change, that sort of central politicization that happened after World War II, particularly with Clinton in the United States and then Blair, where politics came to the middle and people really, there was a point in the, until recently where people felt politics didn't matter anymore, that everyone was just...
Everything's kind of going all right.
Everything's going all right, the world's happy, and we're just going to slowly drift towards this utopia.
Because it's inevitable. Secularism will inevitably lead us to utopia.
Yes. And we'd moved beyond the Cold War and all this. And then all of a sudden, you look at where we are now, 2017, Russia's back in the news, talk about Cold War 2.0.
North Korea, is there almost a new Cold War
Exactly.
for me and my generation and my kids with North Korea?
Yes. Yeah, you've got world leaders threatening nuclear war. You've got all of a sudden the return of a hard right and hard left. You've got just here in Portland, you've got, you've had riots between Antifa and sort of, Trumpian right or hard right figures and neo-Nazis marching in certain places. And this Charlottesville, you've got, these guys in polo shirts using the old German or, using blood and soil, which is an old German term, Blussenboden, blood, the Nazis used. And people are like, what the heck's going on? So I actually think what's happened is we've moved to, in a sense, a fourth culture. The fourth culture is bizarre, and I think it's just forming. So I think we're early days sketching out what's going on. But it's really interesting how Pope John Paul II in his book Memory and Identity said one of the great lessons he felt for his generation was to remember what happened in the 20th century. So Pope John Paul II was Polish, and he lived under both Nazi and Russian or Soviet Union communist rule.
What an experience!
Did seminary in a secret seminary that met under communism. And reading his biography, this George Weigel's biography talks about him. How they had classes when you sort of got these Stalinist secret policemen after him. So he said one of the great tasks is us to remember. So that's why he called that book Memory and Identity. But I think there's been a great forgetting. That the sort of ephemeral, live in the moment life that, as we talked about in one of the previous podcasts, digital capitalism creates.
Yeah, get sucked into Instagram,
exactly.
Order a new thing on Amazon for fun, and, go have brunch.
Exactly. And that first generation to not really remember the Cold War. I think I'm the last, but I remember my dad coming to America in the 80s on business and the fear that he would be killed in a nuclear war. And at the time, there was the Sting song, Hope the Russians Love Their Children Too. And when I still hear that song, I remember the fear of nuclear war. Now, you've got a generation that's grown up without that thought.
I don't
ever.
have any of those memories.
So you've now got these people rediscovering, communism. Like there is a whole thing. People are rediscovering Marxism
and it's like hip
and communism.
and sexy.
It's hip and which people when the Berlin Wall fell, to say that in 20, 30 years people would be rediscovering it would be unbelievable. You've now got with the alt-right this sort of rediscovery of far-right thought, and all of a sudden, people, like a writer like Julia Savola, who was sort of this fascist Italian pagan philosopher. His books are selling on Amazon.
Right, and you have the secularization of the right, almost closer to fascism than the religious right of the 80s and 90s, the moral majority.
Yes.
Now you have rightists who are on, wife number 3, sleeping around, porn, greedy, foul-mouthed, irreligious.
Yes.
But it's socially conservative.
Yes. So it's this return of the radical conservative, and it's a repeat of some of the things, not exactly the same, but some of the sort of things we saw in the 1930s, again in the 1970s. I mean, people forget that in the 1970s, America went through, I can't remember, I think it was 1976, there was a terrorist bombing almost every single day in the United States, all by far left terrorist groups like the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army and the Symbionese Army. And we've returned to that moment, but it seems new because we've forgotten the past. And I think partially what's happened is that meaninglessness that is created by that utopian progressive city.
Right, because it has no meaning. It has no purpose other than just the hedonistic pleasure of the moment.
Exactly. So it has freedom, unlimited freedom, but it has little meaning. So with a little meaning in a secular society, you're not going to necessarily fall back into religion. That will happen to some people. But you'll start to rediscover what Eric Voegelin called the political religions, that sense of utopianism, that sense of a political vision which has religious undertones, which asks for more. So, the term that was used in Charlottesville, blood and soil, is an old term that emerges, from a thinker called Herder, who was trying to imagine this incredible sort of like antidote to the sort of technocratic capitalist society where people rejected that and like thought local and, lived in an area that's why this soil and gave their lives for the nation. So gave blood for the nation. So it's a return to that absolute desire. And particularly, it's no mistake that a lot of young men are connecting with this stuff. There's that desire in a lot of young men for a sense of meaning. So particularly young men who in the progressive culture, which seems so triumphant about 3 or 4 years ago, who were told, men are inherently part of the patriarchy and so on, it's inevitable you're going to get a reaction.
Right. So in this reactionary moment, does politics become the new religion for a secular society?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's fascinating that a lot of people are still struggling to get their head around is there's this move where, if what we were talking about in the last podcast, where there's this move towards relevance, where all of a sudden the Christians all of a sudden want to chill out and be cool and accepting and not be so hung up on stuff and not be fundamentalists and
not be all angry.
Not be angry.
We don't even have to legislate and go to Washington, D.C. We'll just do our own thing.
So you've got that moment. But just as that is happening, you've then got this puritanical tone to some of the left, where the left then moves into what Yuval Levin talks about as they've won the culture war, so they've defined sexuality, their vision is now winning. So what they've got to do is defend that turf. So for a lot of the time before this moment, the left was on the periphery. The left was in the minority position. It could do radical art projects. Andy Warhol could, shoot radical art films. You could have rock and roll could protest. You could have performances on university campuses where you did shocking things because you were in the minority position. But then when you're occupying the commanding heights of the moral culture, you have to defend it. So you've got to censor. You've got to use shame as a tool of defining behavior. So we're in this strange...
So the left almost becomes like the Pharisees of post-Christian culture.
Yeah, so it's, it was Reverend Lovejoy's wife on The Simpsons, that sort of church lady who, I think Dana Carvey had that church lady sort of character. all of a sudden the progressive left sounds like that, just at the time when the Christians are trying to be completely sort of open-minded.
Yeah, it's judgmental, it's angry, it's self-righteous, it's puritanical. If you step out of line, if you say the wrong thing, if you believe the wrong thing, you are just jumped on. But how you live is like, whatever, nobody's really paying attention. But if you stand for the wrong thing or vote for the wrong thing, you're the evil. Like that's the worst of 1980s Christian fundamentalists that I remember growing up. You hear the soundbite of Falwell, whoever on TV, and you just cringe. Like the heart posture is nothing like Jesus. It's Phariseeism for them. But now it's coming from the left.
And there's a huge debate at the moment around free speech and hate speech. And what I find fascinating about that is that you're calling for limits on speech, you're presuming that you have the power to then stop certain kinds of speech. So, for example, dissidents in the USSR would have never presumed to be able to stop certain kinds of speech because they didn't have any power. So implicit to that discussion is that the progressive left is now in power and can control what kind of speech people have. And as we remember from the 1980s and fundamentalist Christianity, is that it creates a reaction.
Right. So now you have the rise of the alt-right, this reaction against the leftist vision. And for the leftists, like the last election was such a fascinating moment for me. If you live in a Portland or in the urban core of a major city that leans left, or in Portland's case is like all the way over on the ground to the left, the election was baffling because you buy into this narrative that we're right, and by we I mean the Portland leftist vision. Everybody else is wrong. We are the march to utopia is inevitable, and it's only a matter of time until people become as smart as we are, and then everybody agrees with us, and we enter into utopia. That's the mindset of a New York, of a media company, of a Portland, of most of the people that I run into on the street. So the idea that there might actually be people that are exposed to your worldview and say no to it is baffling. Like there's just we cannot fathom that reality.
And again to take it back to the Christian fundamentalist analogy, or 1970s Christian fundamentalist analogy, it's the Christian ghetto. But this is the progressive ghetto. This is the progressive sealing off from the world. So, for example, in Australia at the moment, we have a whole national discussion around same-sex marriage. And I just read an article before I came over here, of what neighbourhoods are for same-sex marriage to be legal and what neighbourhoods are against it. And it is stark. It is the inner city, gentrified, predominantly white, hipster neighbourhoods for it, and it's the Arabic working class or Chinese or Indian working class or African working class neighbourhoods which are against it. So there's this whole class element in this which no one talks about. So you've got then this progressive left which has just taken power. It has to defend it. It's using some of the lessons that we learnt the hard way, or using some of the things we learnt, the lessons the hard way, and inevitably you have this reaction. So I think what this does is that this puts a unique pressure on the church. I think the church is ill-equipped for this moment because it's happened so quickly.
Yeah.
And so the church finds itself then with two temptations. And the church can either go, well, we're going to go with the progressive vision, and because it is a vision, because it's a worldview, because it has a justice element.
And because it has some similarity with the vision of Jesus, justice, equality, kindness, civility.
Totally. So a lot of Christians go, oh, that's the stuff we're into, particularly with the, I think, right return to, desire for social justice and evangelicalism. But a lot of people can get on that carriage on that train, but it keeps going to stations where they're not expecting it. And what gets left behind is the engine that is priced. That's a horrible railway metaphor.
No, I get what you're saying. Yeah, and especially as the right looks less and less Christian. I mean, I'm at that age where I remember in the 80s and the 90s, if you were semi-evangelical, which is a word we've all kind of moved on now from, but if you were in that kind of a world, and I get this is a predominantly Anglo-white statement, and so just show me mercy there. But you kind of just assume that the Republican Party, the right vision, was more in line with the way of Jesus than the left.
I'd probably say, I would clarify saying in America, yes. So I'd say in Britain and Australia, there's still a large amount of evangelicals who'd vote for centre-left parties.
And in Pentecostal and communities of color.
Yes.
But there's a strong... My point is there was a strong cultural stream, in particular in Anglo-white evangelicalism, that thought of the right as more Christian than the left.
Yes.
And that has now been blown up.
Yes.
as the left now has more Christian values than the right often does, but yet both of them are very far from the way of Jesus.
And totally. So there's the other temptation. So there's the folks who will, and it's almost like a, so to go back one step, it's almost like a conversion, where I see people who almost are leaving Christianity, and all of a sudden they'll put up something about sexuality or whatever on Facebook, and it's almost like a sort of coming out party that I've now gone to this progressive vision.
I'm liberated now
Yes.
yeah.
And so just a really important thing that's worth noting there is, in the past, in the relevant era, we were trying to be relevant and show the world we weren't uptight, and we might drop the occasional swear word or go to that movie which
we'll
is
have
R,
a drink and we'll talk about Pulp Fiction, which
Yes.
no Christian should ever watch, and what it has to do with the gospel
Yes,
or
exactly.
whatever.
So in that, it was like people outside the church were like, I'm not moral enough to go to church. My life is immoral. You guys are moral. Now it's flipped. Now it's the progressive tone of the West sees the church, and particularly its teachings around sexuality, as immoral.
Yeah.
So now it's like I am moving to this progressive vision because I am more moral than the Christianity that I grew up. That's a game changer.
And that's a shift that I don't think any of us were ready for.
No.
Because, I mean, like that and the sexuality is the best example. When I was a kid, people would hear what I, thought and how I lived when it comes to sexuality when I was a teenager or whatever. And people would think, oh, you're puritanical, you're lame, you're cheesy, whatever. But there was a respect. Most people would say your view of sexuality is a more moral position than my view, which is sleep around, have fun, do whatever you want. Now that has shifted. Now it's thought of as bigotry. It's repressive if you, contain your own sexuality. It's oppressive if you do it to somebody else. So we now have the moral, particularly on the LGBTQ question, but in sexuality in general, we now have the moral low ground in society's eyes rather than the high ground. That is disorienting.
Yes.
And I literally lived through it between high school and now in my 30s.
Yes. I mean, I think the only analogy or the only other time I can think of where this happened would have been around communism and anarchism in the 19th century, early 20th century, where, people who had that vision saw the church as immoral. So, for example, Gustav Princip, who was the Bosnian assassin who shot Franz Ferdinand, which started World War I, he was part of this sect of anarchist, left-leaning young men who swore off women, swore off alcohol, stopped going to the Orthodox Church because they wanted this moral vision. So at that time, they were looking at Christians as immoral and wanting this more extreme. So we sort of returned to a sort of version of that.
Right.
And there's a very also this has to be put in the age of the image. So there's this element that in an age of imagery and online marketing, where we're all marketers now, it can easily begin to fall into that kind of, people jokingly use the term virtue signaling, but that kind of pharisaical.
Right, just present the right image.
Yes.
So who cares if you have prejudice in your heart, as long
Yes.
as you post something against, Charlottesville or whatever
Yes.
on your Instagram account. Hey, you're good. At that point,
Yes.
you check the box. You're the Pharisee. You lined up with the right moral vision, which obviously we're for racial justice. But there's the image thing,
Yes.
rather than the reality of wrestling with your own.
And you can fall into, you see it in my city, you see it in yours, the signs which says we accept everyone of
Yep.
every gender, et cetera, et cetera. Yet often the areas that they're in are the most white, homogenous, affluent.
Wealthy. Yes, exactly. Living in a bubble. Okay, so you said we're running out of time, but you said there are two options.
Yes.
One is you get sucked into the leftist vision.
Yes.
You get on the train in your metaphor because, hey, the leftist vision has a higher value for racial justice than the right does, and a higher value for equality and the rights of women and children, and more angst around socioeconomic injustice. And those are all values that are in line with the way of Jesus.
Yes.
So let's get on the leftist train
Yes.
and vote for whoever and go down that moral vision. But then it takes you places that clearly Jesus does not have in mind.
Yes.
And you end up with a radically different sex ethic. You end up with a radically anti-authoritarian, which ends up meaning anti-Jesus, anti-New Testament, anti-way of, So you end up, so it takes you places you don't want to go as a follower of Jesus. What's the other danger?
Yes. So the other danger is if you are a Orthodox Christian who is concerned by some of these moves, so you look at the culture and you're concerned by stuff that's going on and feel very isolated, all of a sudden you jump online and you may find the alt-right Twitterer or someone on YouTube has a video critiquing some of this stuff. and you find yourself agreeing with a lot of it.
And saying, like, the counter argument to
Yes.
some of these
Yes.
kind of pharisaical
Yes.
ideologies.
And, they're funny and engaging and they make fun of it. And, they're punk rock, a lot of these guys, really, and all of a sudden you start agreeing with it, but then there's other stuff with the package. So there is, with some of the stuff, white nationalism.
Yeah,
there
white
is,
supremacy.
There's all kinds of other stuff that goes with this. And behind this is this more extreme secular version of conservatism. There's the Milo Yiannopoulos and all this, where you hear him, it's like, I agree with that. Hang on, I don't agree with that.
Yeah,
So,
almost has more in line with Nazism or fascism than with the Republican right of the 80s and 90s.
So and I think, if we had more time, I could probably break up some of the different elements of it, because I think it's a coalition of different thoughts that have united in reaction to this overarching moral, new progressive moralism.
And we'll come back to that maybe in another episode, but what's the danger for followers of Jesus?
So the danger of followers of Jesus is that then you return to a sort of new form of cultural Christianity, which isn't what you said before of, I think, the Dockers and the poly shirt tucked in, and the, going to the mega church in the suburbs. This is rather, I don't go to church, but I'm watch Fox News, or I, in England, read the Daily Mail, or I read the Andrew Bolt column in the Herald Sun in Australia. And I'm sort of moral, but I don't want the sexual ethic. And I am sort of increasingly becoming anti-refugee because that's what these guys are saying. And you find yourself drifting to the right. So the big lesson here in this moment of political polarization is all of us have a natural left or right that we're more have a natural disposition
we drift
against.
Toward, yeah.
Yes. So also, so in other words, if I'm really annoyed by the rise of Trump, if I'm really annoyed by the rise of Marine Le Pen in France and all of that, I'm probably not going to become an alt-right guy.
Right.
What is going to happen is I'm going to drift probably into alliances intellectually with people further on the extremes of left. Now, if I'm someone who's really frustrated by the increasing, what I see as the postmodern cultural Marxism of the new progressive left, I'm probably not going to end up, running around streets with an Antifa mask on, smashing up stuff. What is going to happen is I'm probably going to be more syncretized with the right. We always are in more danger of syncretizing and compromising Christianity with the side that we naturally align with more.
Fascinating. Now, because we need to near the end here, I think the most helpful part of this conversation for me is not just pointing out the rise of the hard right, the hard left, what you said, the dangers of how we align with either and compromise the way of Jesus in doing so, but is rather what they both share, and that is the rise of politics as a new religion. And my interpretation of that is essentially, so here we are, we're in this post-Christian moment where, in your language, we want the kingdom without the king. So we want so many, not all, not the sex ethic, but so many of the virtues and values of Jesus' kingdom vision, which was a socio-economic, political vision for his community and for the world. We want at least bits and pieces of that. We want of a world of social justice and freedom and democracy and the egalitarian vision and, good things and food and coffee. We want so much of it, yet we don't want anything to do with Jesus. Now, as we go down that road toward the slow march to utopia, and we don't get there, or a few of us get there, but the rest of the world, we have to stomp on the rest of the world to get there for a bit. The post-Christian, postmodern vision is starting to crack. And so now we have this panic, I think, that's out because we need utopia. We can't look to Christ and his teachings to get there anymore, much less to his return. We can't look to, the return of Jesus to get us to utopia. In the meantime, the way and the teachings of Jesus to live that in advance. So we have to look to something else. And in America, that becomes Washington, D.C., and your political party of choice in, I don't even know what the capital of Australia is. That's so
Canberra.
bad. I can't even say that.
We don't look to Canberra.
Whatever, we don't look to that. So it feels like people, I see so many followers of Jesus getting sucked into this as if the hope of the world isn't the gospel of Jesus and the church. The hope of the world is the right political party with the right legislation in power.
And I think as Christians, then realizing that we submit to the Christian vision. which is a vision for the whole of life. It has individual elements, it has corporate elements, it has political elements. It is a totality of a vision.
Right. Whole life discipleship to Jesus.
Discipleship. And articulating that in a new cultural environment, whether you're an individual at your workplace, whether you're a preacher, is you now have extremes on the right and left. It's no longer just a broad monolithic culture out there that's secular and, just are going to be brought to church, post-Christian. That, I've literally had talks where I will give a talk and someone will come up to me and they're totally progressive and they're critiquing me from the progressive angle and I'm a conservative. Then I've had people who come up to me and they're on the further reaches of the right, critiquing me from the right. And even that's a shock for a lot of Christians because we're used to everyone being on our left. Increasingly, evangelical Orthodox believers will find people who are critiquing them from the right and who are more conservative from them. So it's going into various segments, but us articulating an alternative to those two utopian visions, the utopian vision of globalization, the progressive globalization, where we're going to end up all as this,
happy family
world of, hipster
everybody drinking flat whites
versus the other utopia of nationalism, where we're just going to have this really homogeneous, strong culture where there's no political correctness. Those two utopian visions clash with the utopian vision of the kingdom of God. So articulating that is increasingly more vital in this time.
So where do we put our hope? We do not put our hope in Washington, D.C., in a political party, in a legislation. Not to say those things don't matter. They matter for the health and the flourishing of our society, and I think that followers of Jesus have a role to play in that vision. But our hope is in Jesus. Our hope is in his kingdom. Our hope is in his return, his teaching, his way of life in the meantime.
And what's so important, so just a final thought, is that what unites that new left and new right is that they're both insurgent. So the left-wing party in Britain has been blown up by Jeremy Corbyn, who's from that left side. In the US, the Republican Party has been, blown up by, in Australian, destroyed. I know you mean
no, we say
different.
That too.
Okay.
Well, blow up can be a good thing here.
Like a bomb.
If you have a new, hip hop record, you say it blew up. And that's good. You want it to blow up.
Well, we mean it exploded like a car bomb.
We also mean it in bad ways.
Okay. So Trump exploded the Republican Party. Christianity, though, isn't fully an insurgent, deconstructive thing. It also builds. And so the deconstructive mode that much of Christianity has taken, particularly, I would say, progressive Christianity.
And millennial Christianity.
But also parts of conservative Christianity as well, that we now are in a time where we've got to rebuild lives, rebuild communities, rebuild our faiths. So you're going to find yourself in tension with insurgent forces on your left and right.
On the right and the left, which is great news for, not great news, but is news for a lot of us. And I think, Mark, we were chatting about kind of the last few years, my drift toward more and more of an Anabaptist vision of church and just reading a lot of that history, that kind of alternative story out of the Reformation. And I think what I'm drawn to is this idea of the church as an option C, the church as an embodied kingdom where the hope is rooted not so much in Washington or a political party or a political theory, but the hope is rooted in a community that's practicing the way of Jesus together in their place. And so more and more, that's our hope, that's our agenda, is to embody to the world the kingdom of God, to live under the rule and the reign of God, to live the teachings of Jesus out in flesh and blood through the quiet, everyday mundanity of raising 3 children in the Alphabet District, or going to work each day as a follower of Jesus, as a software designer, barista, or student, and practicing the way of Jesus. That's the invitation. So wherever you do that, wherever you call home, grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. If you could do us a favor, share a link to this with your family and friends. We're still a new podcast. And take a minute and write a review on iTunes. That would be great. On that note, thanks so much for listening. We'll be back with one more conversation on what is post-Christian culture.